second thing is I wanted to get feedback if the council had any about the use of the amphitheater and outdoor spaces language that I have drafted and included in the current draft. And the reason for that is there was at the previous meeting we had interest in that topic, and I just wanted to make sure that people are aware of the exact language now before we present you the full documents, which aren't quite ready yet. So in terms of the negotiating the documents, we had a meeting this morning. We've went through 4 or 5 drafts now with the Eagle Center attorneys. They have 2 separate attorneys drafting the documents. And we're very close to completing the ground lease, which is of the Main Street properties, the use agreement for the Main Street properties, and the facility agreement for the current facility. There'll be a new agreement similar to the old agreement. Those 3 we're very, very close on. There's a handful of items that the Eagle Center needs to get, or the attorneys at Lorkenhoffen need to get from their client, the Eagle Center, in order to finish those. One of the main ones is what the term of the agreement is, which is based on the useful life of the development property. And that's still outstanding, and I want to make sure that we get that right. In my view, it might be different for the facility and the Main Street properties, but that's an engineering function, and we're working with, that should have been done during the pre-design manual, and we believe it was. It's just, we need to get that information. So overall, that's going well. There's 2 agreements that aren't yet drafted. One is a non-disturbance agreement, which is required by MMB. Oh, I take it back. There's one other agreement we've done, and that's the grant agreement. The grant agreement itself has been now drafted and reviewed by me a few times, and we're very close on that one too. And so the 2 agreements outstanding are, I wasn't aware of one of them, which is a non-disturbance agreement that basically explains the tenant's rights, quiet enjoyment of the property. That's required by MMB, and they're drafting that, but they haven't got it to me yet. And the second one is what I'll call a cost disbursement agreement, but is called different things. Title of the document doesn't matter as much, but what that is an agreement that MMB requires when you're using third-party financing. So in this case, the city will be not providing any funds for the project. The funds will entirely come from the bonding funds, but also the NEC's pledges that they've received, mostly pledges. And I don't actually have any facts on this, but I'm waiting for the agreement. But essentially what's going on is they've raised that $1.8 million of pledges, but MMB won't issue the grant until they're sure that that money, those pledges will turn into actual money. And the way that they do that is they use a third-party title company or bank to underwrite pledges. And so that disbursement agreement is basically an agreement that the city, the bank or financial institution, and the NEC sign that lays out the procedures by which the reimbursements will be obtained. And there's an agreement as to how that works and the structure of that. So it's not really controversial at all, but it's got to be done right, and MMB requires it. And they're a little bit late on that, but we've been doing a lot of work on these documents. I don't, after going through this, I don't think this was a 30-day task. I think this is more like a 45-day task, working diligently. So in any event, that's kind of where we're at. And then in the future, we understand there's a meeting on, when I say we, I mean me and the Eagle Center attorneys. I've made them aware that there's a meeting on July 6th, a regular city council meeting, which would mean we would need to get you those documents the week before, which I think will be very tight. I think we'll come close, but I think that will be tight. So I think there'll likely be a request to have a special meeting for this issue the following week, probably the following week, July 12th. So I just wanted to throw that out there so people know that. And if people aren't available, then we'll just have to do it the following week of the following week. So with that, that's kind of where we're at. Anybody can ask questions about that. But then the next topic would be this use amphitheater, an outdoor space kind of paragraph I've drafted into the lease agreement. And it was just easier to put these terms into that agreement than draft a whole separate license agreement. And so I was given direction, not to any specifics, but basically that the city wanted to reserve for the public organizations and the city, a reasonable, what I'll call a reasonable amount of access to that space, so that it can be rented by the Chamber of Commerce or the city or the Main Street program or whoever to hold events, events there. And so with that in mind, we wanted to carve out something that gave the city and those organizations reasonable access to it, without knowing the exact dates or, and it had to be relatively, this wasn't dictated to me by the city, but it has to be relatively specific. I mean, we can't just say that we'll agree to a term of use each year. It needs to be at least a minimum standard that they have to comply with, in my view. So that's what we drafted here. I focused on the useful, what I'll call the useful months of that space, which in my view are May through September. We wouldn't want to put it where they have to give us 30 days, but they give us, 28 days in February and 2 days in March. That's not really okay. And so anyway, so I've drafted this that seemed to be a reasonable amount of time and required that they prepare a schedule each year, and that at your request, you can have access to see the schedule. So I think this accomplishes what we want, but obviously we could still change it. That's why I asked Carolyn to put this on the agenda. There was keen interest in this, and if anybody thinks that it's changing, I'm open to those comments. And then the one,
I'm sorry.
Yep,
You came up with the terms, Mike. Are you saying you came up with the terms that you felt were specific enough and reasonable enough? These are not Eagle Center advised terms.
That's a good question. They said, well, you want use, you can draft a proposal for use. I drafted a proposal for use and sent it to them. The attorneys agree with it, but they put the caveat that they don't think the Eagle Center people have read this yet. But their exact words were, based on their conversations with Meg, they think this will be fine. There was one exception to that I'll explain right now. So to answer your question, Mayor, if they haven't read this exactly, and the attorneys didn't know whether or not they had, but if they haven't read this exactly, it is possible they will request more changes. I've drafted this a long time ago though, and I haven't heard anything. So it'll be up to them to provide those changes or proposed revisions. Then the attorneys did say there was one thing in this paragraph that didn't fit what their understanding of the agreement was, and it's not in there yet. I'm going to have to draft it, but I wanted to get some input on that. And that issue is costs. So they want to charge users of the space, not to make any money, but they want to, in their words, recover their costs. So for example, if they have to hire a cleaning company to clean it after an event, they want to charge a permit fee, essentially, something like a permit fee. That would be a flat fee, but would cover the costs of the maintenance and operation of the outdoor spaces. I don't really have any problem with that. I haven't drafted it yet because we just had that meeting 3 hours ago. But so that with that one caveat, if anybody has questions on the paragraph or that one addition, I could take
the one line that I was curious about was the final line, which reads, the green spaces adjacent to the amphitheater shall at all times remain open to the public. If an entity, let's say RJAC, wanted to rent the space for their use and they were to have a ticketed event, they would probably not agree to that space being open to the public because they can't then have a ticketed event. They can't accomplish that. So that's the only line that didn't make sense to me in terms of how I would understand the space might be used for
yeah, I thought of that.
Yeah.
I thought of that too. And so this gets back to something Council Member Falcom said at the last meeting. He was saying that, and I don't know the exact layout, as well as you do, but that there's, people walk on that normally. It's kind of like a place where people walk to get from the river to up where the development is, like on Main Street. And so do we really want to allow them to block that off for private events? And so I can see it both ways. I can see it not block, having that last sentence to make sure at least that part of the space is open to the public. But then I also see it your way, what if there is an event you know, where you would, the event holder would want to use the space exclusively. So
I'll share my thoughts. I'll share my thoughts on it. I welcome others. Is that the space is vastly, for the vast majority of time, going to be functioning like public space. But the impetus of this is that it also functions for economic development. And so I think that leaving the opportunity for ticketed events, whether it's a local organization, whether it's an extension of an existing music fest, I mean, I think to completely rule that out would be problematic for its potential, in terms of it would limit its potential. You know, the same is true of streets. We sometimes have street dance, but we don't usually have street dance. So I think if there's a way for that to be handled, I would say that, you know, excluding it from the potential of what that space can be, I think would be problematic.
yeah, I can create language that, you know, accomplishes, you know, that it's, you know, most of the time open to the public, but is allowed for closure.
Or
For
then, or
individuals.
something, I don't know, you know,
Yeah.
if there's a way to limit the language, you know, give the language some limiting authority, but not say it's not possible, it's not allowed.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
that's the problem with this whole section. So go ahead, sorry.
Mike, this is Craig Falcom. So, in one of the original plans, there was gonna be a walkway from Big Joe Alley down, more or
Right, like a
less
sidewalk.
straight down
Yeah.
to the river. And then that got thrown out, and then Dean Moyer asked that it put back in. I could see the value of having that sidewalk on that side. And if they do that, that would allow the public to go back and forth between Big Joe Alley and the bicycle walkways without going through the.
Great, and I don't know where that stands, and it's back in. So there too, if you can say that must remain public, that
Yeah.
whatever you call that egress, whatever you name it.
Yeah, I mean,
Behind that, you know, the way it was drawn before, service road. And maybe that's not.
Yeah, this is back in. Problem with keeping the stuff in the amphitheaters that have to go through the upper level of the amphitheater.
I couldn't hear Brian's comment. I'm sorry.
That it's required that you enter that access through the upper level of the amphitheater. So I assume there's hardscaping there at the beginning of that.
It's just the way the grading works out. The ramp into the amphitheater from the upper level, the first to the high level,
Yeah.
the roll of the amphitheater, sidewalk goes
Around.
around the back side of the stage.
Can we have Brian come to the podium and speak? I can't hear him.
I can't hear him.
Owl even? Could you repeat that and just come close to the owl?
This one on.
No.
Dean, I was just saying that walkway is back in the plan, but you have to enter through the top row of the amphitheater to use it. So if there was an Eagle Center event going on in the amphitheater and someone wanted to use that accessible route to get down to the trail, they would have to basically go through the upper level of the amphitheater to get there. Other than that, it's back.
To me, Brian, that don't make any sense. Why would we have to have them enter the amphitheater to access that sidewalk when we have a curb cut up above? Why is that?
It's for grading purposes. I mean, it's hard to explain without pointing at a map, but let me put it this way. If that was an important element that the council wanted changed, the city wanted changed, we could figure out a way to do that.
Well, to me, it makes no sense accessing that sidewalk from the amphitheater, having to go through the amphitheater to do that. So,
Well, some of the requirements of the ACA Act, I think, limit the steepness of the slope.
well, I understand that, but there's always workarounds on that type of stuff. I mean, I would like
Dean's
to-
right. Dean's right. There's a workaround to it. The reason we did it is because it requires a ramp with handrails, and we're trying to avoid two separate ramps with handrails in two separate locations in order to do that, because the grading is really tight to make ADA. But we can put two different ramps and handrails in and make it. that's what the city wants.
I think that's how I imagined it, you know, because it was a standalone before. I think when we thought it'd come back, that'd come back as a separate, no, it wasn't envisioned originally for access, he makes a point of used for access. If that were the case, then, you know, I'd ask that portion of the space be public at all times. But I still stand that, you know, to make the whole thing public at all times, it's gonna really diminish the potential for its use for some entities.
So can I ask a back question then? Is that ramp, when you talk about the path is at the bottom, kind of below the amphitheater?
People call that
And
the
so-
trail, yeah.
The trail, yeah, the trail.
Right, it is the MRT, yeah.
So do we have to have access from across this green space to get to that? Is that something we have to have?
That would be nice, but you know, it's not an absolute, I think.
Okay, because I think
I mean, otherwise you have to walk around the block.
I think it's the right thing to do if it can be done, if it's feasible, I think it's the right thing.
yeah, I think we'll just draft it where it is. We'll take that sentence out, but just put a different sentence in that basically says they have to provide access to whatever the trail is called, in some form for the public to use at all times, and then the rest of it can be roped off. I don't know. I mean, sometimes the layout of things are such that it's hard to draft the agreements. And it's
Not a
hard.
big parcel, yeah. So this is for our information, but not for our action until we see it in the actual agreement. You just wanted us to debate it because we brought it to your attention.
Yeah, if you have any input on it and you've read it, it's just a paragraph. You could give the input. Otherwise, you can email me also, and I'll take any emails on it.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
Were there any comments on the fees structure? Mike, did you want any comments on the fee question? Or should we wait till we hear back from the Eagle Center?
You broke up. I'm sorry. Say that again.
Fee question?
Fee question. Yeah, if people have any input on it, I mean, I don't, I think, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have much problem with them charging a maintenance fee. The city charges fees like that all the time for things that we rent to the public. But if you have any issues with it, it wasn't included in what I was originally thinking, so I don't know if any of the council members know about that. I guess that's more the issue.
Mike, I got a question.
Go ahead, Dean.
It says a minimum of 4 hours. What's the reason for that?
Well, we had to pick something. I didn't want them to be able to, this is written to think. I don't think the Eagle Center is underhanded here, but the way I think of these agreements is, what if they are? If they tried to manipulate the terms of this agreement against us, what kind of language will prevent them from doing that in the unlikely event that that happens? And if you say it's 12 hours per calendar week, in theory, they could just give you 1 hour blocks of time only, and you can't really hold an event in 1 hour. So I wanted to make sure that they didn't do, 1 hour a day, Monday through, 1.5 hours, 90-minute block of time every day. And that's all, you can't really hold an event in 90 minutes.
Let me give you a scenario real quick.
Yeah.
So Music Under the Bridge is 2 hours long.
Right.
So we have a Music Along the River, whatever, and it's 2 hours long. So does that then take up the 4 hour? Is that considered 4 hours?
Yeah, it could be, but keep in mind, these are just minimum requirements.
Well, it says no less than 4 hours.
So, right, but my point though is, yes, I think that's right. I think the way that this is written, it would take up that 4 hour reservation time. So if they did, 3 different 4-hour blocks of time, you're right, it only might get used for half of that time. It might not get used every minute. But, the way I think of it is that's how a lot of these agreements are written. When we do license agreements for events, we license it for 24 hours, but they're not using it for 24 hours. I mean, I think it's going to be pretty hard to write an agreement, I
That
suppose.
caught my attention too, Dean. I had notes on my laptop, which I realized was dead when I grabbed it. I wondered if 2 is more reasonable. The reality is, there's never going to be fighting over this, except maybe on one day. Like I can imagine on our festival days, or in our Septoberfest mode, or in our, Riverboat days, that I find it unlikely that somebody would use it for 4 hours, but I think it would be a bummer if they had to give 4 hours to somebody who could use it for 2, and then another entity couldn't use it for 2. So I would imagine that 2 would be a more realistic and likely use of that. And I don't know if that's,
I'll look at drafting the language a different way. Yeah.
How about 3?
2.5. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about real events and how space is actually utilized. And, it's all on one day during our festivals.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is the blocks of time that they have to schedule.
Right.
So they have to schedule this amount of time. They might schedule more than this amount of time. I mean, I can't imagine the Eagle Center is using that amphitheater 24/7. So, yeah, I mean, I can write something in there that basically says, well, no, I think I can handle it. I get it. Thanks.
I think it's fine. My suggestion might be that it be 2, just so that they don't feel limited by those 4 hours if there is really not demand for it.
Right.
Anything else? All right. Your confidence level that we will have the documents by the 6th, on a scale of 1 to 10, I mean.
Well, by the 6th, the woman, both myself and the main attorney who's drafting it are going out of town for the 4th for a few days, not a full week, but a few days. I think we'll probably have the documents by then. The problem is, will that give you enough time to read them by the 6th? And, if I email them out on Friday, June 30th at 4 p.m., is that enough time to consider them, by the 6th? And I think that's a city decision, not my decision. I'll send them as soon as I have them, and then you can decide when you want to consider the issue.
Will do. All right, thank you. Anything else?
No,
We just share them and then we'll get feedback if people want it on the 6th or they want to wait a month.
Well, given that it's a holiday week, normally I would say 6 business days is a lot of time to process documents. We've had a lot of anticipation of this, a lot of discussion, but given that it's possible that people will not be home, that's a whole different story. So that's a special week. All right, thank you, Mike.
yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for bearing with us. This is a long-standing, important set of contracts we're about to process. So welcome, Mike and Bonnie. We'll anticipate with a lot of enthusiasm in this conversation about our pension plan. The
You
second
might share your screen. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. So share would be helpful. Okay, so several years ago, the city engaged our firm to help them with planning for a variety of improvements. And it was never meant to be something that sits on the shelf untouched once we came up with the initial plan. It was meant to be evolving as you learn more about new projects, as the rules of the game might change, like property tax law could change, local government aid could be reduced, all sorts of things could happen. So the idea was to allow for the city to update this thing from time to time, generally in a workshop fashion as we're in tonight. And it just so council recognizes there's no cost for doing this. So I want you to be fully engaged and not think that you're getting charged per hour or anything like that. Just a quick sidebar. Many years ago, one of my first jobs here was we were between staff during budget season. I was hired to assist in putting the budget together. And we had a special meeting at the ambulance garage. And there got to be a bit of a
discussion about donating dollars. I don't know if it was the chamber or the historical society. I can't remember what it was for. But I'm just sitting there, not thinking it was my place to argue with folks. And one of the council members at the time, I think his name was Steve. Steve. What are we paying to sit here? I said $100 an hour. I said, people were paying him $100. I laughed so hard. Okay, all right. How many of you have actually seen this thing in action? You all have? Everybody? Okay, great. All right, well, then we won't spend a lot of time. But the first thing that I always like to do before we get into the meat of it is to kind of show you where you're headed before we add any new projects. So I see in your packets, you've got one with all the stuff filled in, but I'd like to show you the graphs without anything filled in. So just as an example, I reduced your contributions to your capital improvement fund to more historic levels. I took out all rate increases in your utility bills. I eliminated all these projects down below. And so basically all we're doing is paying for what we got now and where we headed. So, thank
You
you.
were, I think you were in the Zoom mode.
Did I just cancel it?
No, I think. Wait, for some reason.
Yeah. That's what I want. Oh.
So what is the percent of what?
Okay, so tax rate is one of the variables involved in calculating somebody's taxes, of course. And before you even get to tax rate, you have to understand tax base. Sometimes they use the term tax capacity. You ever hear the term tax capacity or tax base? The same thing. The reason I don't like tax capacity is because people think, right? So the next step is once you calculate the tax base of each parcel in the city, you add it all up and you get the entire tax base of the city. Now the city does its budget. It determines how much money it needs to operate, pay debt, all those things. Let's say it's $500,000 is what you're asking taxpayers to pay. And when we added up all the tax base of all the parcels, that adds up to $1 million. $500,000 divided by $1 million of tax base is the city tax rate of 50%. Now we got to go back to the parcel basis. We go to the parcel conservation district HRAs. And that gets all added together. So what this represents, how that drops. The purple is your contributions expected to the capital project fund, and the green is everything else.
What is DSE?
Debt service.
That's
Yeah. Notice how the green is flat going forward. You see how it's not going up or down? That's because we're using the assumption, and we can change this to whatever you like, that each year when you are doing your budget, your debt levies, certain parts of your budget are not subject to negotiation. You got to pay your debt, right? But the rest of the stuff that you budget, what's the cost of living increase? What's the inflation? What's health insurance going to be next year? The idea is to try and control your increase in spending in those areas to match the growth of the tax base. If that's the case, the green portion of your tax rate stays flat like that. But let's say your spending outpaces the tax base growth. And the percentages I'm using are somewhat irrelevant. It's more important in concept. Are we spending quicker than tax base growth? If the case is yes, see how the tax rate now goes up? So this model is all about setting constraints on yourself. You know, Brian's gonna tell you, you know, you need to do this street, this street, this street, fix this, fix that, here's your prices, this is when you should do it. And really no idea how to pay for it. What the model tries to do is you set constraints upon yourself. Mike, we don't want the tax rate going over next. We don't want utility bills going more and whatever. We don't want the monthly cost on somebody going more and whatever. We don't want our debt ratios to exceed a certain amount. We set all the constraints and then we plug stuff in to see how much we can afford. And then we tell Brian, we like your list, but this is what we can afford in this year. What's the best way to spend? Right? So going back to my comment about constraints, we're go back to my original view of a flat growth, the growth kind of a look. If your constraint was to keep the tax rate roughly kind of where it is now, well, 2023 would be a good year. Whenever you do a project and you issue debt, the increased levy hits the following year. So 2023 would be a good year to do it because you got to see this gap. But again, if I go back to that, if we take a pessimistic view, now all of a sudden you can't keep the tax rate flat, right? And conversely, and this is a dangerous view, if your tax base is growing faster than your spending, then you can say, wow, look at all this capacity. We could really do lots of stuff. Now, the danger there is you issue bonds and start paying for projects, warm and fuzzy feeling that the growth is going to happen, but then it doesn't. And you could kimchi. So that's why we generally say, let's just take a flat view of things. But we can take whatever view council sees fit. But I wanted just to see where this was headed right now. The water bill graph is 2 graphs in one. I should maybe okay. You can see that you've instituted some water rate increases over the years. That might be alarming to you, except for I would tell you that you're only now getting to be comparable with other cities for the water rates. And what the bottom part shows is how much a monthly bill would be on a 5,000 gallon user. 5,000 gallons a month, that's basically a family of 3 or 4, take showers every day, they do water in your yard from time to time. The inset graph is projecting the water reserves. And you can see part of the reason your rate increases were going is look at what was going on here in your reserves in your water fund. And now we've kind of stabilized and you can see this growth. But remember, I haven't added any projects. I will tell you that behind the scenes, the water fund is taking into account a percentage increase in operational spending, just like the taxes. It's also anticipating a certain level of capital repair, like water main breaks, things like that are factored in. But despite all that, if we weren't to add anything new, all of a sudden you're going to start to grow the reserves. Now, growing reserves is not a bad thing either because your assets are depreciated. So if you want to replace some things with cash, you need to see that blue line going up, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it. Same thing with the sewer bill. You had a couple of increases here. We anticipate that the fund is going to continue to bleed. But then what happens is in 2022, there's some sewer debt that goes offline. And all of a sudden, you see that reserves go up. So if you're talking about sewer projects, man, wouldn't it be great to wait until 22 or later before we take on too much pressure on the sewer fund? Basically, a combination of capital outlay and fire equipment funds, and it's projecting in the future. Right now, you're putting about $75,000 a year away in the capital project fund, about $30,000 for fire. And you know, on the first page where I had those columns, I don't have enough columns to plug in everything that you've got. So staff has their own spreadsheet that kind of projects spending on a year-to-year basis. So if you want to see whatever is in there, you can do that. But the idea is right now at that $75,000 level, you're either going to have to eliminate some of the spending in that spreadsheet or delay it or something's got to change, right? Cost impact worksheet. This is basically had public here, they would probably be most interested in this. We started this process back in 2013. At that time, the home we used was a value at 150 grand. We expect that house is gonna go up in value every year. That house doesn't stay static, of course, because the county assessor comes in and changes values from time to time. 5,000 gallon user of water, how much more per month will this house pay than it did in 2013? So if we look out here to 2020, 21, it's costing this house about $30 more total for the year than what it did in 2013. Or if you want to look from year to year, you just look at the difference. From 2020 to 21, you know, it's a few bucks more per month. Follow? Now, some homes are gonna go up big time value if they add a new deck, or if the county assessors behind in sales. So I could be understating the difference, but the idea is, you see this line here, this red line, that's basically a 3%. If everything went up 3% a year, things would track with that line. So this would indicate, if you agree that that is a reasonable increase, you know, if you expect cost of services to stay exactly the same, not gonna happen. But what we can do is set constraints on ourselves and say, maybe we're gonna try and use, stay close to that 3% as we can. Debt per capita, we just simply take your total general obligation debt and divide it by your population. So as you pay off debt and as you grow a few people a year, that goes down. This is most important as you think about when you issue debt, what kind of interest rates can you get? As soon as you get over $5,000 debt per capita, you're considered to have elevated debt on a standalone. I will tell you, some cities get dinged, even when they have low debt at the city, they get dinged for high debt because of something called overlapping debt. School, county, you know, you got county jail, school and stuff like that. And your city residents are county residents or school residents. And so the rating agencies will look at the burden on the taxpayer as a whole, but you can only control what you can control. And then we also look at debt to market value. We always want to keep this below 10%. And obviously we're well below there. So
The market value, what's the definition of that? It's the total market value of everything.
yeah, so remember how I talked about tax base on a parcel by parcel? If the tax base all starts with the market value. So the county assessor comes in and says, your house is worth $250,000. You add that up for the whole city, this is our total market value. Now, just recognize that when we go to the tax base step, you could have a $250,000 $250,000 business. County assessor will have a higher tax base than yours.
One question, how come your graphs are different from one of the?
Because I've eliminated all the projects.
Oh,
Yep. Yep, this is if you just pay for what you got now, that's what it would look like. That page that you're holding is when we add in all the projects. Okay, something else I want to hit before we move on, but. Oh, yeah, one other thing. Now, when we did the original plan, as part of that process, you did pay us for that. That was not free. We did a comparative analysis of you against several towns. Staff said, well, how do we stack up? And I said, anecdotally, you stack up very well. Your audit looks pretty good. Your tax rate is reasonable. Your water and sewer bills are competitive. But what I did do was slap together something very quick and dirty. And you know, it always depends on which city you compare to. You know, if you compare to, you can cherry pick and make you look good or bad. And so here we got Eldon, Kellogg, Lake City, Lewiston, Plainview, Waukesha. Some of this stuff might be, oh, maybe I should zoom in, huh?
We can somehow can't see it on the screen.
Oh,
Just
you know
maybe
what?
stop share and reshare.
What's that? Oops. Elgin, Kellogg, Lake City, Lewiston. In Wabasha, some of this data might be a little different now because I don't know if I got everybody work to give you an idea. Taxes, sewer and water bills for the year, $150,000 house. Town, they tell you, people tell you, well, this is the water bill, it's so crazy high. Okay, but your tax rate's.
So when Andy Berg was, excuse me.
Yeah.
So when Andy Berg was here in April, so he had some, he did the audit. So the taxes per capita for Wabasha was
Yeah.
beating all the other cities in Wabasha County and all the class 4 cities, which are what, under 10,000 or something. And as far as the tax rates, that was higher too. So I'm wondering,
Depends on which cities you're picking.
well, he's picking the city in Wabasha County for one, and he's picking class 4 cities. I assume it's all of class 4 cities.
Right. Well, the taxes per capita, I used to do that myself.
Yeah,
I've shied away from it because every city's so different. So let's take Lake City, for instance. They have a marina that makes money like nobody's business, and they're transferring $600,000-700,000 a year. So their
Yeah.
taxes, you know what I mean?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's not like,
yeah,
Right, some cities do really generous cleanup days that cost $50,000 a year. Because twice a year they're going out with dump truck, put whatever you want out on the curb and they come pick it up and it's really costly. So,
yeah. Andy Berg said, when we have an ambulance service that most cities don't have for it, so we're getting for that.
could be even this is not great. Joe Hoffman's the administrator in Preston. He does a really neat study where he takes a house valued at a certain amount with certain characteristics, built in this year, so many square feet, and he tries to find that exact house under those specifications in each community because they're valued.
Mhm.
So while Preston might have a tax rate of over 100%, yours is lower than that, but like 100%, you take that house and you move to Rochester where the tax rate is 40%, and yet the Rochester house might pay more. So it's always a little bit, but just eyeballing Wabasha, I'm doing this for 20-something years. I can tell you that I would not be alarmed if I was where you are, right? I think you're very competitive. You don't have to agree with me, that's just my opinion. Okay, I gotta stop sharing and go back. Wrong one. Reshare, right? Okay, so let's get to the meat of this. So in your packets, you have all these projects. If I was to just add up all of this, we've identified nearly $22 million worth of spending in the next maybe 10 years, less. And that's not including the cash spending out of your capital improvement fund. Remember, I'm tracking that behind the scenes. So quite a bit of spending here. So don't expect these graphs to continue to look pretty. Well, you're already looking at it. So maybe what I'll do is I'm just going to go ahead and plug them all in. Staff and I and the engineer, we met one day for a couple hours, worked our way through this stuff. We followed up with conversations and some changes after that point. Not to tell you that this is your plan. We just wanted to give you a starting point. And you can think apart. This is just what we came up with.
One question is, so the year built, 2021 cost is, let's say Trunk Highway 60 as an example, that's 6.4 million. Cost when built, 3.4 million.
Yep, you have the 4 million.
Okay.
Now see how it's not 6.4 million, it's actually 7.4 million, because if we push it off to 2024. Inflation's gonna make that project more expensive, but then that 7.4 gets knocked down by the 4 million. So now it's 3.4 million. And if we assume a 15-year borrowing at 3.5%, which would be high in today's market, that's a high, we'd be at least a point under that. Your annual payment would be 296 grand a year. If I take a value, a home of 200,000, that represents $153 of the city taxes. Now that's a little bit misleading. It's not to say necessarily that taxes are going to go up $153 because that's not taking into account that you have other projects that might be going offline. But staff just said, is there a way for us to isolate what this is, what portion of their taxes this is for?
Okay.
That makes sense. So, okay, so having plugged all that in, I'm not going to change any of the utility rates or any of the contributions to the capital improvement fund yet. Let's just see where we're going. So, boom. There's your tax rate. And from here, I want to show you, we won't match your graphs yet because I haven't fully caught up. I want to show you the capital outlay fund with this. First of all, see this bit right here? I can't stand it, right? So the reason I can't stand it is if you allow your tax rate to drop like this, and then the next year it goes back up, they won't remember the drop, they'll only remember the up. So I would say budget to a tax rate. So that's why on the first page, you'll see that I have this one-time additional deposit to the capital project fund. I'm going to plug in a number. Let's go to that capital outlay fund before I do. See how it's still going negative? So if we smooth this out, we're going to help that out a little bit. So you get the picture. And then if I go to the capital outlay fund, that helped, right? But we're still not there. So we've changed the 75 contribution to 150,000. Starting next year. Your budget, you're getting into budget season, so, right? Barely. So let's go back to the tax rate. See everything blips up every time I keep adding something. We're not done. I understand there's some kind of a wage study that might be done or is in the process of being done or something's going on with wages, right? And I was asked to just factor in some money for increased payroll, just in case. I used $50,000. Is that on yours? 50,000.
Yeah.
Okay. There's another blip. So you can see going from 21 to 22, 20, 24, kind of there's an increase, but the idea was to try and stay flat. We'll never get this perfectly flat, right? Just recognize it's always, but the idea is to make it more like this instead of that. And for people at Zoom that couldn't see what that was, I apologize. All right, let's look at water bill and sewer bill. Sewer continues to do well. So despite those projects, if you look at the bottom of the column, you'll see which projects the sewer is contributing towards the payments and the water bill. But then you see the water fund kind of staying flat. So we had suggested a small minor increase in water rates. We don't have to agree with this, but just so the idea that this continues, the trend continues to go up. If your cash is growing, auditors would love, in a perfect world, auditors would love you to fully set your rates to cover your debt, your operations, your utility fund, and put money away, to fully cover depreciation, which I feel is unrealistic. But if you see your cash is growing at all, you're at least in part covering depreciation. So when I saw it flat, it was kind of like, well, maybe we should put in some minor increases, but we can back off of that. Just let me get through this and then we'll let you guys attack everything. Anything else that I'm missing? We've got the rate increases, we got the projects again. We showed you this. So let's look at that. Now these things should start to look more like the graphs in your packets. Does your cost to the house look like that? And your debt per capita, we're getting up there, but we're staying underneath that magic number of 5,000. And recognize if you ever did go 5,000, it's not the end of the world. City of Rushford, they set a constraint of 6,000, and they do over. But I generally say let's stay under 5,000. Debt to market value, no worries. So that's what we put together. I'll have to defer to staff and Mr. Malm if you want to get into the details of the projects themselves.
I think that could be helpful, just in terms of some of the assumptions on where the other sources of revenue are coming from and everything.
Sure, you just want me to go through each one?
Yeah, I'll take the bike walk trail extension.
You want to sit here so you're closer to the microphone?
Yeah,
Sure, I can just. So, so Highway 60. So total project cost 6.4 million. We have a city cost plugged in, starts at 2.4 million, and as Mike's spreadsheet does, inflates it to that 3.4 million for the construction year. So that 4 million, what's that 4 million? That is a combination of things. So the Wabasha County would have some cost share in the project because they were planning on reconstructing Highway 30 by the athletic field there by Shields and such. So they plan to spend some money on that stretch anyway. If we build Highway 60, they would still contribute at least what they were planning to spend on that section of roadway. That's our understanding. So I think that's $400-some thousand of that. The rest of that would be outside funding. And what we've looked at for that is potentially either turn back funding from MnDOT. If we do build this and they reroute Highway 60, the current alignment of Highway 60 be transferred to another jurisdiction, either the county or the city. And when MnDOT does that, they typically provide funding that goes along with that turn back. And that money is typically meant to pay for the rehabilitation of that roadway so that you're not taking on ongoing infrastructure liability. The discussion that's been had with this project is the potential of using that money to build this alignment, and then the ongoing liability with that plays into a discussion about the potential turn back of the downtown town roads to the city and who's taking on that roadway. But that's what's been discussed, is using that turn back fund to build that alignment for the overall benefit of the community, which means that if you ended up with the Highway 60 alignment, you'd be taking on a roadway with potentially some increased maintenance responsibility down the road. You'd be taking it on its current condition and using that money to build this alignment instead. The other potential sources of this are, so this project was submitted actually by MnDOT, and MnDOT, the district engineer, did some lobbying for you with Congressman Craig's office. And this project has been included in the House Transportation Bill at the federal level, $3.9 million, I believe. So if there is a federal transportation bill, and if it is passed in the form of the House bill right now, you would received some federal funding, about $3.9 million for the project. And then the other avenue we're pursuing for that is also the capital budget request from the state. Caroline's working on very feverishly the last couple of weeks. So we're pursuing that avenue as well. So we think that the MnDOT turnback funding has high potential. We have a meeting scheduled for them in the next couple of weeks, I think, to discuss that. There will definitely be some level of funding there for that. That's an avenue for other potential grant funding opportunities for that. Yes.
I just want to point out that when we leave today, I hope there's some consensus that, okay, this is what we want, this most recent iteration to look like. Just recognize you're not committing to anything, right? All we're doing is accounting for stuff. So what the idea is that when we get to 2024, you don't just automatically trigger the project. You say, hey, how do things look compared to what we thought they would look? And if things look good, then maybe you do it. If they don't, then we come back and rework things. Okay?
Do we need some sort of commitment on the downtown?
Well, and then I was just gonna say that links into the downtown project. And what we're really trying to figure out there is what level of local funding is the city comfortable with, because that will help us in discussing the cost share with the county on that project. So that project, the downtown project, we're talking about just the loop. So it's Pembroke, Main Street, and then Bridge Avenue back down to Highway 60. So it's that U-shaped loop through downtown. So it's fully reconstructing that whole street utilities. And we have some costs in there for some downtown streetscape improvements, street lighting, that kind of thing. So it's the downtown.
So Pembroke and Bridge are all over the 60. Or how?
And so that one is about just under $6 million, $5.7 million. And we've got that plugged in, 3.7 million for city costs, and then other funding of $2 million. Now that's the one we received MnDOT local road improvement grant funding for 1.2 million. So you have that other funding secured already. So that's in that 2.6 million, I think. Actually, the remainder of that 2.6 million would be in this scenario, the Waukesha County share. And we've had some back and forth with county on cost share. The county engineer made an offer of some funding for this project and for the Second Street project that was not agreeable in the discussion. But we wanted to get an idea from council on, this 3.7 million, something we feel like we can afford, and then we'll play that into the negotiations with the county on their share. Whether that 1.2 million just knocks down the county share, or whether that 1.2 million is split between the county and the city to knock down the city share and portion of the county share. That's up for negotiation. In the end, there's going to be a city share, and we wanted to get some level of comfort from the county.
But on this one, on Bridge Avenue, we're gonna stop at Grant.
Yeah, Grant.
Yeah.
I was,
So we're not going all the way back one.
no, I'm sorry. Yes, we're going, not Bridge to that. We're stopping.
That's under the
Yeah.
6.
You want to go in the room?
Yeah, sorry.
So Brian, I have a question about downtown. So that's a county road. Is the
Yeah.
county initiating this project?
Some places over 100. County has an interest in jurisdictional transfer of those roadways. They don't serve a county purpose anymore. They're kind of holdovers when Highway 60 went through. They don't really serve the county purpose anymore. So the county has an interest, and I think your position on that is if you're going to take that liability on, that roadway on from a jurisdiction standpoint, you want to take it on its current position.
That's exactly what it was. County, when they hand over the
Second Street.
and Bridge, Pembroke.
So,
And the other advantage to this too is that if the county keeps jurisdiction of that, they're likely not going to fully reconstruct it. They're gonna do some, like they did the second, they're gonna do some, double seal coat, a heavy seal coat, something like that. They're gonna spend as minimal as possible to maintain the pavement, because they're just concerned about the pavement.
yeah, so in my simple mind, the road belongs to the county, everything underneath belongs to the city.
There will be, and that's where the cost argument is. It's like, well, who's the curb benefit?
Yeah.
The way that most counties look at county roads, urban areas, is they say, at the lowest level, they say, we're responsible for the center 24 feet, 2 lanes of pavement. That's what the cars drive on, we get through town on our roadway. The parking lanes, the curb, the sidewalk, but we don't build those on county roads. That's a city amenity. At best, they will say, we'll participate in a portion of those costs, 50% of the curb, 50% of the parking lanes. At worst, they'll say, no, it's city cost altogether. Some counties have cost participation policies, Waukesha County doesn't. The argument we're making is that, yeah, the county should be responsible for the center 24 feet, and you should pay at least a share of those other amenities. Storm sewer, at least 50%, especially if there's going to be jurisdictional transfer. So,
I have a question on top of that.
Yeah.
Right, it's probably not pretty. Between Bridge and Walnut, where they.
yeah.
I'll find probably be in one block. Two parallel.
Again, and if it stays county, then you have Felton. So that's downtown. The Second Street one is the other piece of that jurisdiction. Between, get the done, because you have some things happening there at the Eagle Center. Maybe that's your priority, get downtown reconstructed. Second Street could maybe be pushed out to a future year if you needed to do that from an affordability standpoint, or if there's county share on this too, and it's got about 610,000 in that. That needs to be negotiated. And so in the whole scheme of things, county can't afford to put in what's an acceptable share to the city for both of these projects. And maybe you take Second Street and you kick it down the road a few years until the county, that makes sense. But it's the same kind of question with that. Is this palatable from the city standpoint? If that's where the county would kick in $610,000, are you willing to? And we should be clear too that the sewer and water and half the storm sewer in your share of the sidewalk and curb and make that breakdown. We've got breakdowns all the time. That's kind of what the basis. And then
This does include the grant that we got from the DOT and the other category we might have
in the downtown project,
in the downtown.
but the Second Street that wasn't part of it.
So we already got a grant and that's already been included in the numbers. So.
Yeah, but that's part of the negotiation. So you take that grant and you negotiate with the county that, hey,
This.
you get 600,000 credit for the grant, 600,000 credit for the grant. You still got to kick in 2 million.
So that's Second Street East and West or just East?
Just
Just
east
east.
of
Just east.
Pembroke.
Pembroke to Hiawatha.
And then we'd have to figure that out. We only do that because Craig, you'll understand, we need to then maintain the county link down to 60. So there might be a block that maintains county jurisdiction until you get second street transfer. So let's figure that out. The barge terminal, I think we talked about those costs of that, the total project cost, there, and then you've got, the $755,000 is the current funding you have awarded, which is the PDAP grants. That we currently have. Is now we're pursuing the PDIP grant funding and, also, capital.
And this one is totally off any of the projections they see. So we have this 100% externally funded. So the barge terminal isn't costing the city anything.
It's supposed to self-fund as well. It's all set up to self-fund itself. The revenue from the port.
It doesn't, count against your debt ratio because it would not carry a general obligation pledge. Most of your bonds, you're gonna hear that term, general obligation. That means you're backing the bonds with your taxing authority. So if you did GO water, if the water for some reason couldn't make a payment, you'd levy a tax to do it. On this kind of debt, I don't expect you're gonna have the authority to provide that general obligation even if you wanted to. So it's a pure revenue debt, and so you're basically telling the bondholders, we intend to pay you with revenues from the asset. And if the revenues fall short, too bad for you. So as such, the interest rate's higher. So I just plugged in a 5% interest rate. And you'll see down below in the revenue streams, I have other. So there's no city sewer water taxes going into it. It's all being paid for, other revenues. And in fact, I know you're gonna segue to this. They anticipate, they being staff and engineer, but there's gonna be enough revenue not only to cover all that, but maybe generate a little extra, which I think is the 60% on the athletic field next to it.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
So exactly, the athletic field estimate 2.2 million to put those facilities out here and redo the parking lot. That concept that was looked at several years ago. And yeah, the intent is to pay for this portion of the debt for that. It's the revenue from the parking. And
Personally, I think that assumption has its limitations, so that's where we're really aggressively trying to get these capital improvement budget dollars and putting those towards the athletic field. If we can convince the state to do that, to help the project happen simultaneously.
yeah, so your capital budget request have included
The athletic
funding
field.
for the athletic
Mhm.
field, so we're successful with that. And this picture looks a lot greater.
So what you're seeing is assuming that we don't get any capital budget funds, because that is gonna be competitive, but I was told 2 to 3 years, and I think we built this in asking 2 to 3 years, so hopefully we fix it.
2 years for a successful act.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
large.
Yeah,
So that's all I know.
and then the water meters and the sewer, this is a
Oh,
weird term,
yeah. So
um,
water meters is basically a pretty simple. It's just-
Yeah.
The water meters are old, broken, you need to replace them, you're talking about that at the utility level, I think, for a few years. So this is basically the cost of replacing those water meters.
And recognize that in the model, I had to finagle with it. Usually when I do cash, I say cash and pay for it all at once, but in this case, it would be phased, so I manipulated the thing to show that the meters are gonna be paid for over a 3-year span. Technically, with cash out of the sewer and water funds as you go. So that's why you don't see any cash coming out of the water and sewer down below in the middle part of the revenues. It's coming directly, it's reflected in those water and sewer graphs, in the other pages. But that's not a debt, it's showing a debt payment, that's not a debt payment, that's just the average amount we expect you're to spend for 3 years.
And it makes sense to face that too. A lot of meters. Probably makes it a little easier for plumbers to do this. So,
and Pat explained to me that this makes us more efficiently, have less wasted water, so it's a good capital investment because we'll be, we'll potentially more actively collecting money from people. And
Which
then-
I did not factor in at all.
No,
So
not
that
that,
comes in,
yeah,
that'd be-
yeah,
Yeah, keep the icing off the grass.
yeah, exactly.
when meters go bad, they typically charge for more.
Okay,
People always want to argue that my meter's bad, I got charged too much, but it's actually the opposite. So usually you see some improved usage from a
Yeah.
revenue standpoint.
And the computer upgrade, Pat explained that they are no longer replacing the components on the computer system that controls our sewer system. So that was kind of alarming to me. And so, we have this cost 100% funded through the American Recovery Act funds that we're getting. So we haven't yet planned for that, but, that's the 131, 250 is so that grant, because it can be spent on, sewer water projects.
And that's not this, that's not.
Yeah,
the whole-
It's,
all
yeah,
of
it's
what the
it's
supervisor-
the software, yeah, it's,
It should be for $125,000.
It should be. Was the American Recovery Funds bigger than that 130,000?
we are getting, I think, 260 maybe,
Yeah,
so
I
that,
wanted to say we didn't use it all.
yeah, we didn't use it all. But we do think it's important. This seemed like a good project, pretty easy to do. And then the ambulance and fire hall, that was a discussion at the last meeting, so that's plugged in there. For 2022, actually, which we're thinking is pretty soon, but I think when we looked at it, these other really expensive projects are really coming online in 2023. So even pushing out the ambulance and fire hall, we could try that, but I don't think it made a huge difference. The well rehab, I know this was a, priority project for, okay, someone else explain this one, I don't remember this one, yeah.
So you drilled well number 3, that's brand new, and I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, you rehab well number 2 out here. So you pull the pump, replace components, there were parts of the well that need to be replaced. This is doing the same thing to well number 1. Because right now, I think you're only using well number 1 as a backup, I think, as an rehab. This is just good, probably long overdue well maintenance.
We
So where's
talked about this in utilities once, because Pat brought it up. And I think we talked about how it was only being used as a reserve. And I think we decided to start using it. I don't know if that's happened or not, and just ride it until it fails.
Well, the bad part is you're running a pump and it's pumping 50% capacity, so you're
Wasting.
you're kind of wasting a lot of electricity, and that's kind of part of, if we fit it in, to be detected.
Okay, now I'm not gonna be alarmist about this either, but it's not, we've had, you ignore wells like that, it's, bad stuff can happen. We've actually had done wells before where the pump was actually, the parts of the pump are in the bottom of the well. You can't get them off.
Sure.
You only let them go so long before that stuff.
And then where is the 52.5 coming from?
That's
Where?
cash, right?
Okay.
Oh, that's weird. Water.
Okay,
fund, yeah.
okay. All right. And then the last bike walk trail extensions, as you can see, that's moved out to 2025 and planned for 50% match through grants. I was talking to, it was in the comprehensive plan. Dean and I talked about it. We don't really know what the cost would be. And then I was talking to Michael Anderson, who owns a company downtown, Broken Cattle. He mentioned that this is kind of the #1 request that he gets from tourists who are scared to go out on the highway. So we pushed it out to 2025 just to see what it looked like with the 50% match, with the idea that we could start the process of pursuing grants, pursuing fundraising, putting it there.
And we use the same maneuver here as we did on the water meter. So it's not a bonded project. It's cash, but it's not cash out at once. It was spanned over 2 years into your budget.
Do you know which bike walk extensions you're talking about?
I think we would need to decide what our priorities are. So I included a map that was included in the comprehensive plan in the packet. And it would be, if people generally feel like it's a good idea, then we would need to discuss. Oh, I guess I don't see it at all. Okay. Well, I was doing screenshots with it. Okay, not there, but, there's a map I could share. There's a bike walk advocacy group. Obviously your
Yeah.
opinions matter. Yeah,
10
so,
minutes. So
yeah.
I'd like to know what you guys.
Yeah, so I didn't have
Financial
anything in
exercise, which I
mind.
think is gonna help that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have anything in mind. It was, what does that look like? You know, so.
That's really helpful, because Tony and Craig and I, and a lot of citizens participate in that group, and it's kind of this like, we're being urged to apply for these little like mini grants, and mini grants are not gonna get us there, they will get us toward an actual cost estimate, however, so. It's good to put it in there.
And to add on to bike paths, we do have a residence here in Long Beach that want to do it, bike path easement to the property. That's true.
I have a question, and I'm sorry, I was just trying to listen and concentrate. You mentioned, I guess Mike had said, this taxes from projects, not really taxes from projects, it's more of a, kind of, we give it some sense, some sort of value. These ones that don't have one,
Paid with other
they're
revenues,
all
like,
paid for another revenue.
like water, sewer.
Okay,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that it wasn't because there was an uncertainty built into the calculation.
Is that a really nice way of saying it? Mess up.
No, no. It's just, I just
My
want
wife
to.
does that. I'm confused. She's
You
not
made
confused. She
sense.
knows
I
full
always,
well.
sometimes I make assumptions that are not correct, so I want to make sure that I was hearing correctly, which it is.
You could almost consider this as like worst case scenario if we didn't get additional funding coming in, so.
Yeah, but then again, it maybe it's rosy in the sense that maybe figures are way higher at those times than what I'm showing you. Again, when the government is still.
Yeah.
It's,
But
I'll guarantee you this, that what we put together here for projection, I think is reasonable. I'll guarantee you that it's wrong. But I think it do a decent. In general, that's
And I think
what works.
what's helpful is, as we hear about the need for ambulance and fire hall, it's important to see if we pay for that, how does that impact a street project? And
in time.
timing and trunk highway 60. So I think, I don't know if this needs another meeting, or I think I'm looking for direction on, because one thing is we've been pursuing a lot of funding for the trunk highway 60 project. We've pursued funding for the downtown project. So if all those funds come in, are we gonna say, oh, we're not gonna move forward, because that would poorly reflect the city of Wabasha. So I was maybe taking a risk in applying for all these funds, but the deadlines were before we could do this meeting.
So, two thoughts on that. Number one, the period of the allowability to fund use, I guess, factors in, and that might be a good follow-up meeting. Maybe not everybody's interested in that. I'm interested in that with regards, want to count our pennies, but it would be interesting to me to understand the timeline associated with those funds before I was real eager to say, hey, it looks like we're not have any problem with fire ambulance. Or you could share that with us as you learn more and share this in writing. Basically, the allowable period of expenditure.
Do you know what it is for the one we just got for the downtown?
Yeah, those are 2023 dollars. So like $2023 with our, so that one. And I think there is some flexibility in that, so for some reason that did, for whatever reason, have to be pushed. Probably some flexibility there.
And you were sounded like pretty good about what you were learning about the PDAC funds. Have we learned any more? Or I should say the program manager seems to not express a lot of concern about this.
Yeah, no, I don't need more specific. So, I'm not saying more. But we don't have a. I'm issue with that.
More or less planning, because of. Let's say, one advance, and then you go, it's like almost this thing.
Oh, right, that the downtown project, just given the level of interest that will be a part of the project, given the impact of businesses that that project will have, all those things that Caroline and I talked about that, we should really start this late summer fall. But-
Yes, and more on
Yeah.
it. Earlier,
So
more.
then we discussed how are we paying for those costs earlier on, and the answer was we could issue a bond now, or,
No, well, Mike can speak to it better. Either pay cash or you can find.
Right, so the only person that in this room that benefits from temporary financing. But you can do it if you need to. What I would do is I put this capital outlay fund and take a look. And I say, okay, we know in 2027 we're zero. But in the meantime, we've got some money in there. And one of the things you can do when you issue debt is you can always size the debt to reimburse. So imagine if this line dipped down because you paid a bunch of engineering, but then when we issued the financing, you put the money there. That makes sense. And then if we find that even that strategy then is, we feel scrapped, then we'll talk about temporary financing. But just recognize that that's a nice plan B, but let's try to avoid that. And I think you probably. Who are you using, Bolton and Maine? Oh, wait, maybe.
No, we never like those guys. This is good.
So, Tony, with this, I'm not the other one, not showing any going all the way. Aren't we planning on going all the way?
No, we are actually going to do ground ordinance, street assessment, which will get probably. And that'll give us an idea, but our plan was, we have a couple of sections that are bad. Blocks here, there. Well, if we wait and do them with 2023, when they're in town, we could probably get a better cost.
Do that little area on Washington.
Yeah, Market Street from the hill down to Washington, and then there's bad water. Yeah, we've had 3 or 4 water main breaks in there, so we would do that block. So there's gonna be a few little add-ons here and there, but it's probably not gonna be good.
Now, like, between our downtown and our Second Street project, we have Allegheny, that runs on the library there. In hills, will those be touched up too, right now?
Well, and then we did build an overlay in there.
Good.
Yeah,
I was done in 19.
the Second Street was done west, so we would just be going east, over the county road.
Now, that one's good there.
What's the effect of the construction?
Hi,
inflation
I'm meeting
factor?
Al. To get started,
Can we
download the
expect
Meeting
that
Owl
to-
app on your
Is that a
phone.
good estimate you got there, 5%?
Well, we can use whatever you want. Are you saying it should be higher or lower?
I'm just the way the economy's going, feeling right now, it seems like.
It seems to
Inflation
me,
may be-
inflation is lower than that, on the whole, but it seems to me construction and improvement costs have been greater.
We always use 5%, to be honest, and, I've never had that be too low.
Yeah,
Now, for this long of a projection, we're talking like this year, next year, all of that drop. Well, for example, from last year to this year, we saw significant increases in pipes because the Texas deep freeze shut down PVC resin plants and all of a sudden you pipe for stuff. And depending on when you were bidding a project and how panicked the pipe suppliers were about capacity, you were seeing prices all over the board. So it's so dependent on things that timing things have. 5% over 2 or 3 projections.
Now, with downtown project, will we be, not the, sewer and water line, like one of the businesses? My understanding, we have multiple lines that are.
Yeah,
People like to do on Western.
what we typically do is, that's part of the planning, when you start, early, you gotta figure out where we think everything is, and we try to clean up, get rid of shared services, get rid of services around the buildings and all that stuff, and just try to clean.
It could be 2 years.
It could be, we'll look at that as part of the plan. I mean, it will be 2 construction years for sure. They always leave the last layer of asphalt up for the next year. But you could even split it up.
Then you have Eagle Center stuff going on, so.
Nothing else.
Fun.
So that's actually next year after that.
A lot of confidence, but afterwards.
The vast, been clear, the vast majority of that early Eagle Center will be interior. Right? Still tracking,
Well, I think this winter, they want to do stuff.
so they will.
Next summer will be all.
First, I guess I was thinking about the open space for sure, but I. Is there anything missing? I mean, Carolyn, you're new, but you've asked really good questions about it. This is really being talked about and the priorities that were, council brought different priorities to your attention. Did anything get left off that we should maybe, add at some point or you just throw?
I think the one thing that everybody said was housing. And that's a tricky one that we could try to brainstorm on is, I think people would love to see more single family housing development. But I think it's challenging to, the cost of the home and the construction cost is not going to pay for the infrastructure. So that's not in here. However, I will say that is kind of baked into the Trunk Highway 60 project and the athletic field move, that then we have developable land for commercial and housing. So we haven't put any incentives to bring anybody here. But when I was talking to Brian, he said like part of his plan for the Trunk Highway 60 is that there would be sewer and water connections there. And then as we're pursuing capital funding, we're asking for money to clean the slough there. So that's a nicer water feature and add a trail through there. So I think the hope is we could just attract a developer along with that project and achieve the housing goal that people have talked a lot about. But we didn't obviously include incentives for housing in this plan.
Well, for the most part, incentives would be isolating future property taxes
Yeah.
on a temporary basis. I would just caution as you move forward, always strive, I'm on board with incentives for housing because housing just doesn't pencil. But the developer pays for everything up front. And what they're gonna try and do is say, well, we'll have the city put in the sewer and water and do these assessments. And I've done that in the past, and I'll do it if you want me to, but I've seen cities get burned. So I would just say developer fronts everything, and then if we can do pay-as-you-go tax reimbursement on homes we wouldn't have had otherwise, great. But in that way, you don't have to account for them, because we don't have those homes now. We're not accounting for them, so. But what we could do is when the contract is over with the developers, plan on some tax base that we don't have. That just might put that seed in your head. Developer funds it.
I like it. Yeah, because I found there's too many times coordinating in the development, streets and utilities. There wasn't enough room allowed or something. Okay.
I had one client in southeastern Minnesota that was paying half the improvements for the developer. And the funny thing is about housing, even though we want it, you need customers, you need employees, you need kids in the school district. But those homes, they are consumers. They consume more in service than what they pay in taxes. So, we'll be excited to say, oh gosh, we can take half that building roads that you can charge more for the lot of money. You, the developer, pay for everything, and then if these ones get built, we'll isolate those taxes, reimburse you for your project costs for a period of time, and you, whatever. And then there's no risk to the city, and you don't have to find it. It's money and money.
I guess we're kind of looking for feedback. Do we continue to pursue these assumptions with the county of the city share? And do we continue to pursue planning for Second Street, or are we moving that out? And what's, you know, those are the more.
I want to propose one thing for the downtown.
Okay.
So we definitely look at that, Walnut, Main Street and Walnut Bridge. They got widen that out. Well, that's my opinion. I don't know if that's. Or that, for the cost.
Look at the angle parking there. Awesome.
Why do we want to this means we can, build all that.
Is the
Well, we got-
yeah. Yeah, that can be bigger than.
Oh, we don't need to figure it out, all the way up to, don't even want that.
Oh, I have to look it up, James, to be honest with you, like, I can't find it. I wanna walk it, yeah.
We're talking from the Anderson house, like back towards.
Yeah, so underneath the bridge. So basically from,
That makes bridge to the one.
yeah,
Okay.
where the old city hall is all the way. to the end.
Yeah.
If you look at it, it's truly the other side is kind of dives in a little bit.
Sure.
Well,
I mean, it's worth looking at. I don't know.
we
If
got both sides, doesn't accommodate, I don't work.
Here's what I'd say. I don't know you need to decide that now. If you want us to look at that as a part of the planning for the project.
Yeah.
That absolutely, look at it, we'll draw some diagrams up, we'll show you what it would look like, we'll show you what the cost would be, all those kinds of things. So that's not a big deal with including planning. And then you'll be deciding based on, some actual information.
And public input might support that, or, not, we'll get a lot.
No parking is important, and we can gain some people have more stalls, we get, this. You'll probably do some boulevard space when they're.
Do it, and work the home. Okay.
Yeah.
So, again, just to clarify, the Second Street, same underlying rationale, full utilities, right? And jurisdictional, willingness for jurisdictional.
No county purpose for road finance, you have that utilities. And when Chad was here, we talked about this quite a bit, that, you're taking on an infrastructure liability, right? But you're now in control of infrastructure. How is the county maintaining that road? They follow the community along that. Clearly, you're taking on more infrastructure. But in the whole scheme of things, I don't want to get too complicated with this when you think about it. So we're gonna have a bunch of jurisdictional transfer calls happen. Highway 60 is gonna have, meaning the county loses mileage. Highway 60 is going away, meaning NDOT loses mileage. City is gaining a bunch of mileage with downtown and Second Street. Well, maybe then the Highway 60 thing is just between the county and the state. And the county gains the Highway 60 mileage and loses over here. So there's a mileage shuffling game to play here. And then what's the overall benefit to the community? Taking on more street mileage, but I don't want to sugarcoat for either. Yeah, right now.
It's yours, it's yours.
It's gonna be yours.
Forever.
Yeah.
We'll go back, right?
Subsequent will change some of that, too, but it's small beans and.
Well, yeah, and then we haven't really counted assessments and this whole thing either.
A minor vote, on Second Street, just 10%.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Which is probably reasonable. All years. I mean, we're usually talking about 20%, but that's on. Sorry.
Yeah, it's only 10% of the portion, not 10%.
So, yeah, this is really, thanks for this, because I think, having this ambulance fire conversation come up, has there been further input from the departments about the urgency of, we hashed it out, but we didn't give them a full opportunity to present their needs? What are those conversations look like with regards to timing?
So we met with, Ed Rainer and there in South Carolina, we met with Warrington Associates, we worked on the library project. And we worked through 3 different scenarios, so basically what they're gonna come back and they're gonna give us a price, which we'll bring to you for consideration is a feasibility study. What are you gonna get out of plan A, plan B, or building new schools? And so we won't really know on the numbers until we decide to move forward, but because there's so many things that there's so many
In the conversation, I got the sense that Darren felt, that the need is rather urgent, but there's a lot of different ways to solve the problem. And then the sense I got from Ed was, he imagined there's probably improvements that need to be made, but he wasn't sensing this much urgency. Did that change? Are they different timelines?
That's why we talked about, we talked within the next 3 years, I think. So, I mean, that's close. And the number, I mean, we're not gonna have any idea on that number.
So do you want to show them what it looks like if we put it in 2024? I think the rates, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, let me just undo that for a second. So the cost was $13 and $29. So combined, the cost was. Why did we see that? It's over $50. Now, if we go to 2024 and we'll look at the graphs. It didn't go up a tremendous amount.
42 to 46.
Sorry.
That was in 42 to 446.
Oh, 42, yeah, okay, yeah, can't do math, not yet, yeah, okay. So, not a big deal there, let's look at the tax rate, and I think what you're gonna see, watch quickly, because I think the thing's gonna go, beep, right? Just so small. So, I think that's one where construction inflation is not as big of a deal, but that's based on these numbers, right? Can you build what you need to build for that kind of money?
Yeah, and we got, it could be up to $1 million, and then we're basically what was shared, which is interesting to me, was which community was it? I don't know, St. Charles or something. They did this exact thing, and they concluded we're gonna build new, but then obviously that was really expensive, and so nothing's happened. So, yeah.
Should be clear, I'm sorry, go back on that downtown project, just double checking. So that when we had run numbers on the city county cost share, what we felt was reasonable, they had described it based on other counties' cost share policy. The county paying for the center 24 feet, and paying for share of the parking lanes and sidewalk and curb and such. That came out on the downtown project, $2 million. And so the way that this set up a nice spreadsheet, assuming that the city and the county would split that, that $1.2 million.
Yep.
Now, that same maneuver that you just did with regards to timing, you asked about Second Street timing, is a much bigger project. Does that have a significant impact on this overall?
Let's move it out to what, 25 or something?
Sure.
Just to see. So now you see how it's kind of bouncing up, where before it was a little bit smoother.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, 2023. Was it 2013 that we did the big, we did a road, we did a public improvement bond, it was of some size. And that's, the plan has always been to do something roughly around that 2023 time. Did you manage?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, yeah. I remember that project, I really like. Probably one of the months streets with that, you go to Google Earth, you can see it was from 2012. Right?
Mike, do you have a way of putting this into a percentage tax increase? Because usually that's kind of when we all ring the shock when we see.
Well,
So
so
budget time.
I'm going to show you a little bit of the, making of sausage there. I'm not trying to hide it. So here's your anticipated total levy increase. Let's go up to 22. So next year, and, they don't necessarily have to be this way, but you're looking at 7-8% next year, and I think most of that had to do with if we included 50,000 for additional payroll and upped our contribution to CIP from 75 to 150, and all that kind of comes in. But if I average this out for the next 4 or 5 years, it's basically 4% a year. But yeah, this would be kind of a bump. But you can see in the past, these are actual numbers here. Where you've done. I remember this one. I think this might have been David Schmidt that was watching, right?
2012 street fund.
Yeah.
That was great.
Well, that, and also you wanted to reduce your reliance on local government.
That's helpful. Good question,
Yeah,
Tony.
thanks. Any other questions? Or direction for us, then what you want to be thinking about,
I guess, new to it, does anyone think, does it make sense to continue to have conversations with the county and pursue grants with the assumptions that were made in this worksheet?
I think so. Okay.
I want to make sure everybody's clear too about I can't, but just so you understand where we're last at with the county.
I was gonna say, it's not good.
So, we're showing as a result of this, like $6 million community projects. If where they are. They offered just under $700,000 total for both of them. That was there. We sent them something even higher than what this shows. Basically, the county paying for all the roadway, the city only paying for their share of the utilities. They said no, and they came back with $693,000. So now we're going back with this. That's where it sits right now.
But we needed to have this before we knew what, and then find out that you got the money too.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So it's a good moment. We've had good news with this street group.
Yeah, I just don't know what their ability is to, I don't know what 690 would be based, I don't know what it's based on, but I don't know.
Well, I'm thinking that might be their top figure. They're thinking what they're gonna lose, or what they won't have to pay in future years is maintenance on that road and future reconstruction costs. And future reconstruction costs are probably overlays. And future maintenance costs, they don't give the city very much money to maintain it. So they're really, for them, it's, they were gonna sink much money in the next few years anyway, so.
That's what this is based on. This was based on their feeling that only portions of the curve. That only the center 24. The neighborhood will be fine. Things have been fit.
Yeah, and so they were just gonna put bare bones in the future anyway, so they're not gonna offer up a whole lot of money. But you can always.
Well,
argue.
think about that too, is you correct me if I'm wrong, Craig, but I'm not sure about how many people are in that city, but you're allowed a certain amount of mileage you can apply. to state aid, designated state aid. So if these roads are freed up, and become local, they can then take that mileage and apply it to other county roads, state aid.
Well, the state aid mileage shrink somewhat, so their state aid allocation would shrink somewhat.
They'll get them to redesignate the mileage and something else that needs a state purpose.
They can. But if they have, you have to have, it has to be serving a state purpose.
Right, yeah. Which, you know, it's, I just didn't want to, we were not $300,000 apart.
If it turns out to be pretty close to the same or just a tad bit more, we'll have to regroup and figure out, well, how much we can put in. But then is there a way to go to like county board, like meetings and state your case and kind of go that route, or is it just once it's?
Yeah, I think you could, you're gonna have one commissioner who's probably gonna vote our way, but you can appeal to the other commissioners that have municipalities in their districts.
Point several examples of county road reconstruction municipality, county participation, full reconstruction, dramatically higher than this without transfer. Much smaller. But several.
In Watershed.
Not in Watershed, no, but several.
11 years I wrestled with that board, so I don't know.
You're saying that?
Like we gotta represent this.
Yeah, we need to restart that conversation so that we can figure out our next step.
Ideally, it'd be nice to know at some point what the.
Right. And then we'll revisit some of these assumptions when we start the budget talks. That's coming up.
So I think that in terms of, the operating budget and capital improvement plan will be approved and discussed in more detail this summer. But if I'm hearing correctly, Brian and I are going in with these numbers into our negotiations with the county. Okay. All right. That's, I think, what we needed to know, and then we will continue on the path to pursue these key projects listed here. But I think in terms of how this is formally adopted will be kind of happening in the year advancing, but I think we would be coming in with a request to begin planning for the downtown project this year. Okay. And then in terms of approval for some of the water sewer projects that we have here, I think we'll be putting that on the agenda, the utility agenda, and also formally approving the computer usage as we have future talks on how we want to spend that allocation.
Yeah, and I guess that additional American Recovery Act, did you, through all your conversations, contemplate what you think would be an actual use for those remaining funds, or that's sort of decided?
Yeah, I wanted to bring some of what I had heard, but then do we not yet know what the actual dollar amount is? We think it's going to be somewhere around 260 to 280, but we thought it prudent to wait till we have the final dollar amount. But I know it's gonna be at least enough to cover this project, and then kind of discussion.
And some direct guidance on how to use this still not a plan either.
Yeah. But we could have a discussion at the next meeting of approximately what areas that council desires us to look into for consideration, knowing basically what's qualified.
Were you talking using that money for the sewer computer and the Main Street project? For sewer related,
Just
water related
the,
things in that?
just the software. I think we discussed using it for the downtown project, but when we played around with the numbers and advanced meetings to this, it didn't even impact anything, and it seemed that we could do greater impact to the community on smaller projects than a giant project where
It's just a little drop in the bucket.
it's gonna be
Sure,
like a
makes
penny
sense.
difference or something. So, but what I am hopeful is that, for example, on Second Street, keeping our eye on additional stimulus funds that is prioritized through our water just at a statewide level. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that as soon as we see opportunities, we can kind of bring these numbers down, as Tony mentioned, through pursuing all
I
opportunities.
do think we'll be able to use it all in some
Yeah.
capacity.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
We wouldn't want to leave anything on the
Yeah,
table.
yeah.
if we don't have to.
And another thing, for example, I learned is that we could get some really generous financing through USDA rural loan program, like a 40-year loan term on the fire hall and ambulance for a lower percentage rate, like 2.2%, 40-year term. So on
Which
fire
we're not
and
showing.
ambulance.
We're not showing that because,
Yeah.
again, it goes to the point where if you can do better,
Yeah.
okay,
Mhm.
better.
But it seems like that 100% makes sense to get a 40-year loan term at 2.2 rather than,
The only
You know,
thing to
yeah.
consider there, and I don't need to extend this.
Yep,
Real quick, it's just that they're gonna wanna be in the approval process of all your plans, specs. And then they might reserve the right to audit additional facilities, like they might say, yeah, we're funding fire and ambulance, but, boy, City Hall needs a ramp. You know what I mean? They could- So then all of a sudden, your project becomes more expensive or maybe.
Okay.
We had this conversation all the time, it's like, gosh, federal money's expensive
Yeah.
to use, yeah.
Straight up, absolutely, that would be that's the route to pursue, but we didn't account for it. just because of that reason.
On the top of our, aid money too, that you're talking about, Wabash County, we are able to apply to them for projects that they come up, and we can have us consider them too.
I thought Brian and I in the negotiations could maybe ask Wabasha County maybe to use some of their American Recovery Act funds to help pay for the downtown and Second Street, since it kind of benefits and involves them.
Sure.
Mhm.
All right. Suck the air out of this room or what? It's a beautiful day outside, believe it or not. All right, I think we could entertain a motion to adjourn unless you have any further.
I so moved.
Brian? Tim,
Me.
Tim, we have a first, we have a second.
I will.
Now it's Brian, any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
This is very helpful. This is very helpful to Caroline too, as she waits for funding announcements to pop up with no notice.